Hi.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you here. I'm just going to take a few moments to let everyone arrive into the Zoom room before we jump in, but we're really grateful to have you here. All right, so I'm again, welcome everyone who's just arriving. I'm going to give some housekeeping notes before we get started. So I'm Ashley. I am the Director of Communications at the Vasculitis Foundation. I'm going to introduce our special guest, Stacey, in a moment. But again, some housekeeping rules first, or things first. So as you all can see, as you've come in, you're on mute for us today. This is just to minimize background noise so we can really focus on what Stacey has to share tonight. But we're so grateful for you're here. We want you to engage with us. So throughout the conversation in the chat, if you want to respond to something Stacey said, we'd love for you to use the chat option. There's also going to be time at the end for questions and answers. Stacey's going to answer some of your questions. So there's a separate, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A box. If you click that, we'd love for you to put your question specifically for Stacey in the Q&A box. So the chat is reserved for reflecting on the conversation that's happening. And then the Q&A box is for asking any questions that perhaps Stacey will get a chance to answer at the end. The other thing is the last about 10 minutes of the webinar tonight we'll reserve for breakout rooms for whoever wants to stay. You don't have to, but we'd love for you to join us. It will be a chance for you to break out into smaller groups and reflect on what you heard tonight and on how it connects to your own experiences. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to watch it again or share it with a friend, it'll be available in about a week for you to do that. Let's see, I'm looking at my notes, what else I need to let you know. I think that's about it. What I would like to do though, since you all are here and this is our Living with Vasculitis series meant to be community oriented and to engage on these sort of softer topics, not important, but softer topics of living with vasculitis. I was hoping we can all just take a moment to sort of take the collective pulse of the group, of the collective mood. So if you want, in the chat, I invite you all to write one word describing how you're feeling right now. It could be you're feeling creative, it could be you're feeling tired, it could be uncertain, grateful. So go ahead in the chat if you want to, and just let us know how you're doing tonight with one word. I'm going to put mine in the chat here. Oh, I love that hopeful. Marty's feeling overwhelmed, a few people feeling overwhelmed and conflicted. Yeah, I think the stress is real, right? Nervous, excited, Stacey says. Yeah, Stacey's in the spotlight tonight. Oh, unwell today, Patty, I'm sorry. Sending you lots of care and comfort. Lots of happy, nervous, excited. Emma, I love that, appreciative. Yeah, we're appreciative of all of you here. So you're welcome to add more words if you want to, but we're gonna jump in now. I'm gonna introduce Stacey. So Stacey has been living with vasculitis for over 20 years. She's a therapist who got her Master's of Social Work from the University of Toronto. She's completed postgraduate training in techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy and family-based therapy for eating disorders, amongst many others. What I love is that on her bio, on her website, she writes, "I enjoy coffee, exploring, and creating. I love connecting with my friends and family. I currently work part-time, mom full-time, practice yoga gently, and mindfulness in short sessions daily." Stacey, I'm excited and grateful to have you here to share your journey and your insights with us tonight.
Thanks, Ashley, for inviting me to be here, and for everyone who's joined us. I see some familiar names and faces, so I'm looking forward to connecting with you as we're able, especially in the breakout groups later. And that was a very lovely intro, so thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's mostly your words, so thank you. So I guess to start, if you can give us a very brief history of your vasculitis, what type of vasculitis you have, when you were diagnosed, and anything else you think is relevant to that part of your journey.
Yeah, so I was a kid who had asthma since I was little, about 3 or 4, and allergies and things like that. And around age 12, things started to get worse. Some things were thought to be just the asthma worsening, and then there was other symptoms that would happen, like swelling in my hands and feet, and it was really random. I was pretty involved in figure skating at that point in my life as a kid. And by that, I mean, I skated 5-6 days a week for a few hours each day. And so when I had swelling in my feet, it really annoyed me initially, and I wanted a reason why. And it didn't get any answers. And then it went away just as quickly as it started coming. It disappeared, and I didn't have any issues for about a year. And then when I went to high school, I started to have gastro issues and was diagnosed with IBD. They thought it looked weird. It wasn't exactly IBD. It wasn't exactly Crohn's or colitis, but that was the best they could do. Got a little bit better, then had some other health issues come up. By the time I was 15, I was connected with Sick Kids in Toronto. And that's where I started to get a little bit more care that was appropriate to what was happening for me. And then finally at 17, after being in hospital for about 6 weeks, they finally gave me a diagnosis of EGPA. And I had significant lung involvement. So that was following a lung biopsy. And it was a really hard time. It really was. Getting diagnosed and getting some treatment, that allowed me to get back to being like a teenager. And that's all I was trying to do for a few years there, was just be like all the other kids. Once I had some treatment, I was able to like finish school, like high school, and go off to university. I was healthy for a number of years, so I was able to pursue things I was really interested in. I went on exchange to Australia and traveled a lot independently. I met my husband and we got married and had babies. And then, you know, as a young mom, not a lot of sleep, I had another flare. And so had to deal with that and learn kind of to do things a different way.
Yeah, you've talked about the ebbs and flows of your journey and a vasculitis journey. And I think that's going to be part of our conversation tonight, including around this theme tonight. It's living with vasculitis, radical acceptance. So what does radical acceptance mean to you?
Yeah, so it's something that I've found really grounding once I learned about it, which wasn't until like I was in grad school. So it may have been helpful earlier on. And it's this idea that you stay oriented to what's happening. You don't deny it or push it away or minimize it. You acknowledge it in the good and the bad for what it is. So for me, I try to stay present to, you know, the sensations in my body that are coming up. What are they communicating to me? I try to rate that so that I have an idea, because pain can sometimes be overwhelming, and trying to get pinpointed on how much pain, where, what it's like. So actually going in and towards it at times, also emotions or thoughts, sometimes the stories that I have in my head are like catastrophizing, being able to say, oh, I'm jumping to conclusions right now. I don't know for certain that's going to happen, and just kind of sit with that for a minute and then decide what to do. And that's the key part of radical acceptance, at least for me, is being able to acknowledge what's happening and then go, okay, what's next? This thing is happening. Now, how do I want to proceed?
Yeah, when you and I had been talking about this topic in advance, you had mentioned that two things can be true at once. Like you can have vasculitis, you cannot like it, you cannot think it's a blessing, and still you can, and you can correct me if these are not the right words, like sort of make peace with it or accept the reality of it so that you're not caught in this cycle of suffering. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there can be a lot of energy spent in pushing away the experience, so pushing away pain or pushing away uncomfortable emotions, trying to avoid, right? Pushing it. And that just kind of creates more suffering in my experience, how I've found life with chronic illness and dealing with different things. So I just have to stay present. That's the challenge, is staying connected to what's happening right now. And then the judgment of, do I like this or not? That's later. So that's where that can, I don't like having vasculitis. I really don't, despite meeting all you wonderful folks and like getting to do some really cool things and create content and that's meaningful, and really finding a purpose connected to this community. I still don't like having vasculitis. And so both those things are true.
Yeah, and you said something about like pushing it away. And I guess that means like an energetic resisting it. Like, I don't want this. Like, is that sort of the energy when you're just like, this is
Right. So I don't know what it's like for you, Ashley, but I think everyone's experienced pain at different times. And sometimes we get so absorbed by it, or we spend a lot of time kind of being like, I'm fine. I got this. It's not a big deal. I'm not going to lie. That's usually what I do quite frequently, but to my own detriment. And so I've learned to kind of turn towards it and go, oh, there's pain there.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't like that. Oh, what's it communicating? What does it mean that I need, or what's missing, or who do I need to connect with to find out more? Because I'm not a doctor.
You seem to be listening to it. Yeah, because it can go either way. You can like push it away and ignore it, or lean too deeply into it. So it seems to be this like lesson in balance of how to.
Yeah. Grounding in curiosity is what I talk about with my clients, is like, okay, let's ask some questions. When we can get to that place of asking questions, for me, that's like a good place.
Yeah, and just to set up more of this conversation before we dive into some specifics, you had mentioned also to me that this doesn't mean that it's about radical acceptance, doesn't mean you're transforming your challenges into blessings. You don't have to have the attitude of like, oh, vasculitis is this blessing, and thank gosh I got it because all of these things happen because of it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so that's something that's come up not just in relation to vasculitis, but at other times. May I speak to those other times? Yeah. So my mom was killed in a car crash, and people would say, well, she's in a better place. That was super hard. And I found it really hurtful because she was a healthy 40-something who I really needed. She didn't want to go. She wasn't ready. That's not helpful to say she's in a better place, at least not to me. And so really, when we talk about radical acceptance, it's saying like this terrible thing can happen, and you can have all of the emotions and the grief along with it. It can all be there, and it doesn't have to define what comes next.
And it feels like the hard parts can exist with the joy, that there's room for both of these things when you're present and you acknowledge all of it.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Like, it's not easy. It's a practice.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I guess you've mentioned also like it's when you can't control what happens to you, but you can react to it. You can choose what comes next. To me, it has this feeling of like flowing, like being like water, being flexible, being open. Can you give us an example of how that's played out in your life with vasculitis? I'm sure all the time, but if you can give a concrete example of that.
Yeah. So sometimes I'm not sure if has as much flow. Like, it sounds nice. I wish it did, but sometimes it's sitting kind of in the river. That like life is flowing. What direction do I want to go? Am I going with the current? Do I need to work harder to go against the current right now? Do I need to get out of this river? What's my best choice given my goals, given my needs and my preferences, my values? Like, really taking that all into account. And so it does require a minute to like consider, right? And like the river keeps flowing. So
yeah. But that's where you get that sense of agency, because you can't control what happened to you, but you can get to choose, even if it's limited options, you can get to choose how you move forward now, like what step you take next, given your circumstances.
yeah, I think being present to it allows you to notice like what are those needs and what are those preferences. For folks who've worked with me before, I say those things a lot because that is agency to me. Knowing what those things are, attuning with it, and then choosing based on those things. And if there's no like good options, things that are like perfectly aligned with your values, or you're definitely not preferring what's happening, it's like what matters most right now. So like for me as a mom, I lean into like what's important for my kids, in times that it feels really hard. What's important right now for my kids, or what's the least bad option here? Like, sometimes it's how am I getting out of this alive? Like I've had some scary moments, and that's what's driving. But I prefer to be in places where it's not about survival and it's about choosing things to thrive.
Yeah, there can be that decision fatigue. So I love that, like, even just thinking, what's the least bad option? Like, let me look through what's available to me. But I wanted to bring it into a more specific lens. So we wanted to talk about body image tonight, and the impact of vasculitis on body image. And you said in the past that, our there's an emphasis in our culture on images, and that's how we communicate to each other. Just think about like Instagram as a platform. It's like based on photos and very little else, like how you see each other. There's dating apps where you swipe yes or no based on an image. And so when your body might shift or change, whether it's because of vasculitis or something else like that, I feel like it can be hard to navigate the world and make peace with it. And yeah, so how has your own body image been challenged by your vasculitis journey?
Yeah, so as a kid, I was really involved in figure skating. So there is an emphasis not just on performance, but on how you look as you do these incredible things, like and smiling during it and things like that. So I think there was a hyper awareness in my childhood. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I was very aware of how I was perceived. And so when things like going on prednisone as a teenager and having my face really puff out and then getting stretch marks in all sorts of places and having just change, it was brutal. I didn't cope well, and I didn't have language to express what that was like to go through it. My mom was a huge support, and her strategy was, well, let's find something that lights you up. Like, what's the color you want to wear today? What thing is going to bring you a little bit of joy and help you to feel a little more comfortable or confident stepping out into the world. And so that was helpful. Any kinds of ideas around, well, how you present isn't as important as how you're feeling, or that wasn't as much of the language that we had. It was a time thing. I think there's a lot more available for folks looking for ways to manage body image now than 20 years ago. And I'm grateful for that. I've worked with folks where that's been really difficult. And personally, trying to diet while you're on a medication like prednisone and just trying to stay alive, that was not always the best decision I could have made. Like it didn't do a lot for my mental well-being, but also I don't think it helped my body to be nourished and be able to recover from some of the things that were happening.
Yeah, one of the things I try to do sometimes if I notice that I'm beating myself up over something or just not being gentle with myself is I'm like, oh, I imagine talking to like a younger version of myself or a child. And all of a sudden, like, oh, I greet that child with unconditional love, and my response to that situation is very different. And so now that you're not 17, I mean, not that you're not going through similar circumstances, you still have vasculitis, but what would you say to that 17-year-old you who is struggling with prednisone and body image and your body changing, which is such a hard thing at any age under any circumstances, but especially
everyone's body does change. It just maybe happens faster for those of us who take medications or are dealing with health struggles that limit our mobility or cause us pain. And so have a little bit of grace that, things change, and it will change for everyone. The other thing I talk about with my daughter, so I'm able to kind of speak into not a younger version of me, but a younger person who's becoming aware of beauty standards. She's 9. And she'll comment on things. And I say, honey, you're beautiful. And that's the least interesting thing about you. And it really is. She's like a vivacious, brilliant little kid. And like, she has so many cool ideas and very capable and talented. And I think she's beautiful. And that's about the least interesting thing. So, yeah.
Oh, I love that. Yes, absolutely the least interesting thing about her. One of the things that I noticed, I was listening into one of our support groups recently, and there was a woman named Susie, and she was talking about how she has a walking stick now. And so she doesn't like having a walking stick. This is obviously not her ideal. She would much prefer to be able to go out without her walking stick, but she's trying to take back some agency and bring a little bit of joy to a situation that's not ideal. And so now she orders her walking stick from a special place, and she has one that lights up every time it hits the ground, or ones that have like stars. Like, she makes sure that they're they bring her some laughter or joy in an unbidden circumstance. As a, whether a human or a therapist, do you want to speak to the idea of like taking a little bit of agency back, or how we can do that?
Yeah, I think that we all have moments where like choice points, and something can be, uncomfortable, or we wish we didn't have to use that to get around. I at this point in my life, I also have an ostomy, so I've had to learn how to deal with my body vastly differently. And for me, it's like I choose what I wear, and not to hide the ostomy, but to feel confident and that I don't have to tell everyone my story. You're all here, and I'm happy to share certain parts of it. And so, I still do wear like a two-piece bathing suit, but and so you can see some of the scarves that I have, so that someone could ask, but it's a choice, right? And so taking those choices, finding them, choosing how I do my hair, choosing the things I do have control with right now, that's what I think is really important for me. And I emphasize that with clients, like, okay, when you have something that you don't want, what's one thing you can take back, like take back control of, or take ownership of in this circumstance right now? So not in 5 years, but like at this moment, what is it?
Yeah, and I like that you talked about things that are visible, or we were talking about the walking stick before, because some people don't have the choice to hide it. As maybe they have a dialysis port in their arm, or Susie has a walking stick. And sometimes you want to go out in the world and not have people ask you all of those questions. And so I like your thought of like, okay, what can you, even in those spaces, like take back a little bit? You control, you do your hair, or choose a color that you like. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing you'd mentioned, you were a figure skater growing up. I was a competitive gymnast, so I understand that. You probably spent a gazillion hours ice skating, and it sort of consumes your life. And there's a lot of focus on perfection and performance and how you look. And so you've talked about a little bit with me, like your journey of uh, letting go of that perfection, which I can relate to, and that you can still sort of carry it into certain spaces, including with vasculitis, and that there can be pressure on people living with vasculitis to be the perfect patient and to do the right thing and to have the like right care. And if you have a flare or something goes awry, for lack of a better word, that you can feel like, oh, you failed or you did something wrong. Tell me a little bit more about your experience with that.
I think it's something I still struggle with, to be fair, in that I want to, I have my checklists of things. So taking my meds or moving my body. I have my watch that reminds me to stand up between clients, like I have all these things. And at the same time, it can feel like a lot of work, and like a work that doesn't end. And so the giving up can come into play, I find, for me, that's like opposite the perfection, right? And holds it in balance. And I don't find that's a place where I like to sit, is where I feel stuck and hopeless. It's very uncomfortable. So for me, the perfection, it can help me get out of that place because it feels a bit better. I don't know if that fits for you.
Yeah, I get the idea of like you can feel stuck in your choices because you want to do it perfectly. And so then there can be this sense of like either being overwhelmed, or you just don't take action because you don't know what the right action could be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, if you were to talk to your daughter or a client, like what might you say if they're feeling the pressure of, and it's not just being a perfect patient, it's, perfect mom, perfect, all the other labels.
All of the things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talk about doing 70% in our house. That's our thing. Like, how can you get it done and get a B, like for our kids with schoolwork? Because otherwise they have maybe learned from their mom and dad to push a little too hard, or stay up a little too late to finish things, or get distracted and don't want to hand something in. So we talk about, let's aim here. What's doable right now. And for our kids, that's reasonable. For myself, when I'm thinking of like what's non-negotiable. So eating 3 times a day because I can get distracted or I can get busy. I need to nourish myself. Otherwise I feel terrible. And I do need to move my body, even if it's just a little bit, even in times when I've been recovering from surgery. And when I say move my body, it doesn't necessarily mean stand up and walk. There's been times I can't.
Mhm.
And so it means like, can I reposition and can I do something with my arms? Or sometimes there's IVs. Like, it's what can I do? Can someone massage my feet? And can I move them back and forth? Then I'll focus on that.
Mm.
Just enough.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I know, at least for myself, I'll try to just keep doing the same things, even when my body is telling me I can't do those things anymore, or I'm overwhelming myself because I'm trying to do it perfectly each time. And so that like lesson of learning, like, okay, what other things can you do of these choices? Like, how else can you find movement that maybe doesn't look like the movement you did before, but still gives you that a little bit of sensation, a little bit of freedom, or whatever else that why you choose to move your body.
Yeah. Did I mention, I think I maybe told you, I started using modeling clay after my last surgery to like make like Christmas ornaments because we were coming up on the season. And that was something I could focus on, and it involved movement with my hands, but the rest of me could be still because it needed to be. And I could put my attention and focus and like the bounciness of my brain out into something.
Mm.
Mm.
And I feel like that's a perfect example of radical acceptance, because this is not maybe the type of movement that you would choose or the type of use of your hands.
I
But
was
it's
not a crafty kid. This is not something I would have went to. I was a movement kid. I liked being outside and I liked, doing sports. So arts and crafts weren't my thing, but I found it because it at least gave me some expression and my hands got to move.
yeah, exactly. And I have more questions for you, but I just want to remind people that if you have questions for Stacey, we're going to take some questions in a few minutes. If you can put them in the Q&A box, that would be wonderful. So the other thing I've been thinking about is, you work, as you said, you work part-time, you're a full-time mom, you have vasculitis, you have a full life, you're a wife, and things can come up with vasculitis where you're sick or in the hospital or you're exhausted or you just don't have the same perhaps energy level. And so maybe this is an impossible question, but I'm just kind of like, how do you balance that? Like, how do you rest? How do you make sure that you're getting rest while you're doing everything else? I just have lots of how questions. I don't know how else you want to.
Yeah. I've had to learn how to say no, which I wasn't very good at a long time ago. I do say no to things, and it can hurt my heart. But I say no to the things that I know get in the way of my sleep schedule. So I keep a pretty rigid sleep schedule because I need to. Again, with the eating, I do follow certain things so that I can function, as far as like I eat 3 times a day every day. I need to do that. I've learned that. And hydration, you'll see me sipping at water. So I get thirsty, I think, way quicker than most folks. So that's something I can't go without. So knowing what those needs are and building from there. So I say no to others or to activities or to work, even to my kids, in order to say yes to these like basic things I have to have, or everything else falls apart.
Yeah. Because then you can, like you said, over push and then it all falls apart. So I like that it sounds like you're building in these non-negotiables for your care. You've got to eat 3 times a day. You've got to make sure you have water. You make sure you have a solid sleep schedule. I'm also wondering though, because you said you do have to say no to things. And I think that's a human experience, but particularly when you're dealing with a chronic illness, do you ever feel angry or sad?
Yes.
Like yeah.
Yeah, I've changed how I view certain emotions. So I see them as information and data points. So if I get angry, again, I start asking questions. It's as a practice I've learned through doing my own work with my own therapist. Okay, what of my values or the things I really care about? What's being threatened right now? Because usually that's when I get angry. Other people, it might be other things, but what's being threatened right now? Because that's why I'm angry. And then I go from there. My connection with my kids, because I'm working too much. That's why I'm feeling frustrated. Or I'm angry because like someone I care about isn't getting care they need. And I see the missing link, and that's really hard for me to sit with, having navigated a whole bunch of systems throughout my life.
When you ask that question, like, and you realize that it's because you don't have what was it with your kids?
Because I'm not connected with them because
Right,
I'm
okay.
distracted by
Yeah.
work. Like I'm a working mom like many others. That happens. Yeah.
So what would be the next step? Like you have this inquiry, you realize, oh, that's the thing that's being threatened. I recognize it. How does that help you move forward?
So in my world, anger is an action-oriented emotion. So it means it needs a response. I need to do something with that. So it might mean I block off a day to take my kids to do something, like a Saturday or a Sunday or another day during the week. It might mean I close for new referrals. That I'm often closed for new referrals because yeah, I can only work a certain amount of time. Yeah. And with my husband, I talk to him and I say, hey, something's got to give here. Like sometimes it's a conversation we have. Mhm.
Yeah, I think I'm just processing. I think that's interesting to me because I also find sometimes I don't have vasculitis. I have some other
Yeah,
health
anger happens though.
right now. So just like humans, and so sometimes the choices that are given to me, they threaten my identity of how I see myself, of how I want to show up at work, of how I want to show up with people. And people will suggest like alternatives, like maybe, like you said, something has to give. And sometimes my first response is to be like, well, no, I don't want that, because I'm looking for this perfect picture that regardless of life is just not perfect. And so I think it goes back to that, like, well, what choices do I have? What can I, like, what are my non-negotiables? What are my values in order to like make the next decision?
Yeah, like it can be really hard with some of these things that we've talked about. Something's got to give. Well, what are those things?
Yeah.
Do I really want to give up? Like, we all are dealing with inflation right now. Do I really want to say no to more clients when we have more bills? No. And I have to.
Mm. Yeah.
Do I want to take my kids out of school to have time with them because I was sick on the weekend because I did too much? No, that's not fair to them. That's not a good parenting decision. Okay. These options suck. Sorry, but sometimes they do.
I'd rather you be honest about like the hard parts. I think so many of us here have hard parts, and it's nice to be honest and say like, yeah, this is real and this is hard.
Yeah. So the first thing that I usually give on is like the tidiness of my house. That's not a thing. Like there's usually stuff not in its place. The floor, we have a dog, generally needs vacuumed. Like it gets it at least once a week. It needs it more. It's not going to happen. So there's just things that those aren't on the top of my list. They might be on someone else's, but for me, that's what can give. That's what does give every time, right? First, and then we go from there. It's not unsanitary. Don't worry, really. Okay.
You got a dog. There's just lots of hair. I get it.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing that before we take some questions, I wanted you to comment on, well, I guess there are a couple of things, but yeah, I just said like it's important to acknowledge the hard parts. And you had said to me, we do a disservice to each other when we don't talk about the hard parts. And I know you wanted to be careful about that because you don't want it to just be about the hard parts, or that we can also celebrate or have lightness. But can you speak to the power of community and being able to talk about all of it, including being honest?
Hard part. Yeah. Those can be the most vulnerable conversations, I think. Whether we have them in a big group at like kind of a more surface level, or like in an intimate connection with a partner or like a best friend or a parent, they're still really difficult conversations to acknowledge like pain or what's suffering or how another person's actions are not helping us, like in the most gentle terms, right? And they're the most important conversations because it's through that kind of the rupture and the repair that we build intimacy. Right. And that's a therapist thing. So I really do believe in it, though. It has played out.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead. There are a couple questions in our Q&A box. If anyone wants to add some more while we're going through these, please do so. So the first one is from Christina, and Christina said, I'm in my early 50s with grown kids still at home, diagnosed with MPA within the last 4 years. What I find is that these past years have me stuck in a worry cycle, losing balance with life, suspect feeling burned out with combination of living with chronic disease and keeping up with work-life tasks. When at home, I worry about work. When at work, I worry about home and medical appointments, etc. She said, would you recommend cognitive behavioral therapy in general for people feeling this way?
In general, yeah, I think it can be really helpful. It is important when you have chronic illness to connect with someone who's worked with others with chronic illness, because some of the strategies we use in CBT can feel a bit dismissive with rare diseases that are chronic and like relapsing and remitting. So that's my only caution is like, it's really helpful. It's a great modality, and it's important to have someone who can adapt it to your circumstances realistically. And there's lots of folks out there. The other thing is most therapists, many of us, are responsive. So if you notice you're working with someone and they don't seem to be taking your personal circumstances that are actually happening into account in providing the therapy, it's important to voice that. So that might be one of those hard conversations where there's like rupture and repair. But it will help that therapeutic relationship, and it gives that person the opportunity to get consultation or training so they can better meet your needs.
Thank you for that, Stacey. We have another question from Susan. And Susan, I'm sorry, I'm trying to read and listen to Stacey at the same time. So we're going to do our best here. But Susan's talking about she has COVID-induced vasculitis. She says, I was diagnosed with a skin biopsy showing small vessel vasculitis after 14 months of trying to convince multiple doctors that I had vasculitis. My doctors are unwilling to try any treatments because the mechanism is unknown. So she's talking about she has unexplained bruising and other issues. And she's wondering more specifically about like COVID-induced vasculitis, which I don't think is necessarily the focus tonight. But Susan, to speak to your question, it sounds like you're feeling like you're not being heard by your doctors or maybe by people in your life, which I imagine is frustrating. Stacey, do you want to, not that I expect you to be an expert in everything, but do you want to?
I can't answer it medically, but person to person, like, that is one of the most challenging things, is getting care that you need when you need it, and having doctors listen. And I think we have some resources on VOV with the self-advocacy part that could be really helpful. If you haven't looked at them, give them a check, check them out. The biggest thing is to go in with an open mind to your doctor and see how they can support you. And sometimes you have to be really courageous and say, hey, that's not going to work. And that's a hard thing to do. So, if you need to bring someone with you to the appointment so that they can help you with that, that can help a lot. Yeah.
Someone else that earlier in the chat had talked about, in response to the bio I read of you, that you practice yoga gently, and she said she's trying to practice it gently too, but also sort of listen to her body and know when it's the right thing and when it's not. What do you do in those moments? Like you talked about, maybe sometimes it's a yoga day and sometimes it's like you just need to use your hands. Is that just something that you practice over time, of how to tune into your body and what it needs without over pushing? It's probably a delicate balance.
It is a super delicate balance. And I think it's one of those attunement things. So with your practice with gymnastics, with mine, with figure skating, we get to know about micro movements with our muscles. And I think that can be really helpful for folks who are just getting moving, even if you don't have a history in one of these performance sports. But all muscles have like a range. And so you don't have to push them to the extreme. Sometimes it's just about tensing and releasing. Sometimes it is the small things that are really important. So I do have a practice around that where I just kind of tense and release muscles. Sometimes it's just about standing and flexing a certain muscle group. And I'm talking for 5 minutes. Like there's times when that's it. And even between clients, when I'm here at the office, I try to schedule breaks so that I can do some micro movements. And that seems to keep me feeling better. So.
And I love that addition, that it can just be for 5 minutes, that it doesn't have to be an hour or 45 minutes or even a half an hour, that sometimes 5 minutes is just enough. We have another question from Eric, and he said, have you received different advice from different doctors? If so, how did you accept this?
Yeah, I have. And my training as a social worker is to get them to talk to each other. So when they're all in the same medical practice or hospital or building, they can communicate with each other at something like rounds or do consults. If they're in different places, you have to sign consent so that they'll talk to each other. But that is the biggest piece of advice, is get them to talk to each other rather than through you, unless you're trained as a medical provider, because there's lots that it's hard to understand the nuance, right? And it's not your job, you're a patient. So get them to talk to each other. That's what they're supposed to do. And if you can, if there's two parties with like two opposing views of treatment, see if you can find like another medical practitioner who's maybe not a specialist, but maybe it could be your general practitioner or nurse practitioner, who can explain the risks and benefits to you. It could, if it's with a medication, it could be the pharmacist could take a really like balanced approach and tell you about the risks and benefits and why they're being proposed. And that can help you choose, because ultimately it's your body, and they're giving you advice.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like getting curious again, asking the questions, being your own advocate, even when
Collecting data, right?
Yeah, collecting data, exactly. Another thing I wanted to ask you is, when you are living with a chronic illness, it could feel sometimes, especially as you're going, like maybe initially or when you're going through a flare, like your life is focused around that and you're consumed by appointments and just all of it. Do you have a practice ever in like staying grounded in all that you are beyond just a label of vasculitis?
Yeah, so that's about I do the best I can in that moment. So in that moment, the health thing has to take priority. And so it's being able to turn to my husband and say, hey, kids are on you for the next week. It's being able to email my clients and being like, I'm taking a week. I need a week. If people do not like that, it's also, I have a good network of supports of colleagues who I'm like, if my clients need a person, they have a person to connect with. Those are all key. So it's knowing who's around to pick up the other aspects. And then I do focus on the health thing when it's the priority. And I don't know, I used to apologize a lot for that to people, like to friends for canceling, or to my husband for having to do more. We chose to do this thing together, right? Yeah. So remembering that we chose that together. So yeah.
Yeah, not apologizing is really key too. This is like a small thing, but sometimes I flip it around and rather say like, I'm sorry for, it's like, thank you for your understanding. Thank you for helping me, kind of rephrasing it a little bit. So I'm not apologizing for being who I am or for feeling what I'm feeling.
Yeah, sometimes I even go to the like most sarcastic side. I'm sorry, I'm keeping myself alive.
Yeah.
Like, oh, right. That's
A reminder.
what I need to do right now.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll probably take one more question from Marty and then go into some breakout rooms. So Marty says, recently diagnosed with polyarteritis nodosa, and also found out yesterday they are looking at sorry, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, cryoblastopenia. I'm less than 3 months into my vasculitis working here journey, so still getting the language, but okay. Marty says, very overwhelmed with lack of information regarding it all. Doctors are being wonderful, but I'm struggling to accept all the information and just trying to understand it all and accept it all. Any suggestions on ways to wrap your mind around all the new life-changing information? Trying my best to stay positive.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot, right? And so sometimes it's sitting with the information they provide and kind of writing out the questions. I do have a journal practice. I keep notebooks almost everywhere. And when I don't have a notebook handy, I just make a note in my phone, because I'm a millennial and I do that.
Me too.
But I do find that's really grounding, is making little notes if it's questions, or if it's like, here's the information I have, and then seeing what happens after I kind of clear through the clutter of all of the things. Here's like the key pieces. Okay, now what do I think? What do I need? What do I want? What information do I still need to make a good decision? The best decision I can right now? Who can I talk to? So that's the next piece. Who can you talk to? There's often nurse educators attached to some rheumatology programs. or your doctors want to ask questions. They might not always have time, so they could point you into the person who acts as that resource in that program. You could talk to a therapist. We don't have the medical jargon in the same way, but we will make space for you and help you with some of these practices of reflecting and kind of figuring out what's the missing piece that you need to feel confident in the next step. So that can be really helpful.
Thank you. And I said one more question, but we've got one more in the Q&A, so I want to get that answered, and then if people want to stay on for breakout rooms. So this is from an anonymous participant. How do you suggest navigating conversations with family who might be a bit dismissive or don't understand the gravity of being diagnosed with a serious illness? I was diagnosed with GPA only weeks ago as a person in my late 20s, and it's been pretty overwhelming to digest. Sometimes it feels like nobody in my support system, like older parents, can understand now that they aren't as intimately involved in my medical care as they once were.
Yeah, so there's different approaches depending on the people you're dealing with, depending on your family, what's going to work better for you. You initially assume they want to understand and they just can't, because it is a rare disease. Very few people understand it. And it might be about breaking it into little like bite-sized pieces, just like you need to do for yourself to know what you need to explain your needs to others. Other folks it's an invisible illness. And unless you are laying in a hospital bed, they're not going to get it. And I'm really sorry, because that sucks when that happens. And with those folks, you just need to have really clear boundaries. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. Here's how you can help. And here's how I don't want you to be involved. That's it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And what I also want to add is that this person who asked the question mentioned that they are in their 20s, and next week on Wednesday night, and maybe my colleague Jen, we just can put this in the chat, we're hosting a young adult panel discussion we have 4 panelists who are in their 20s who are going to be talking about their experience with vasculitis, everything from dating to jobs to school to friendships, all of that. So perhaps you'd want to do that. So again, if Jen or Ed has the capacity to put that in the chat right now, that would be wonderful. Stacey, what I'm going to do now is first just thank you for this last 45 minutes. I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing and just your kind way of expressing your journey and supporting others in that, and that really matters. So thanks for being nourishing to the community tonight. And what we're going to do now is, if you want to stay, we'd love for you all to join us for breakout rooms, and you can sort of reflect. But before, Stacey, I don't know if there's anything you want to add in their last final moments before Jen puts us in breakout rooms.
Thank you, Ashley, for hosting this. And yeah, I appreciated getting the chance to tell kind of my story and my journey with vasculitis, and also for the great questions tonight. I think these were all really important to how you kind of do this whole radical acceptance thing, because it can be kind of a big concept, but on the ground, what does it look like? So thank you.
Yeah, I should add, thank you all for showing up, for being here, for your thoughtful questions. That means a lot too.